Hi, teachers. Today I want to go over the first part of the Introduction to Demand lesson that I do with the kids. Usually, rather than trying to hit them with the determinants and all of the basics of the model all at once, I usually break it up into two 48-minute lessons. So this video is going to cover the first of the lessons and cover some of the things that the kids commonly struggle with and some things that they don't usually get the first time, and it's going to require a little bit of practice. So the first thing I do is I usually draw them just any given demand schedule. I found, especially this year, that some of my students have difficulty understanding how to manipulate the graphs that we use in this class. So one of the things I'll always have them do is I'll put up a demand schedule and I'll put up a blank supply and demand kind of model, just the X and the Y axis. And I'll actually ask them to go and to graph all of the different points. So I'll make them plot all the points from the demand schedule and then connect the dots. That's something that depending on your kids, you may or may not want to do, but I found that even for some kids that I didn't realize, when I have them do this, it forces them to make sure that they understand how the demand schedule relates to the demand curve that we have over here. So what you see here is basically what I make them graph. I use some pretty simple numbers. There's no sense in getting too fancy over here. You just make sure that you give your graph a title. It could be tacos or whatever it was. I think today we did supply and demand of Spurs tickets, but whatever works for you. Once we spend about 10 or 15 minutes going over exactly how the graph works and how movements are, I'll probably go back over, even though we've already hit the law of demand, I'll make sure to reiterate that. I then move into the first major point of confusion the students have, which is differentiating between demand and quantity demanded. So getting the kids to be able to differentiate between the concepts of demand and quantity demanded is one of the constant struggles I have every year when I teach this lesson. And it's a really, really important point to emphasize and spend some time on, even though it seems like something you wouldn't want to spend a lot of time on. Spend 15 or 20 minutes on this concept, because this is something that it's really, really simple to get wrong, like especially writing the FRQs. If the kids aren't thinking, they'll use demand and quantity demanded interchangeably. And that's one of those places where a kid who actually knows the answer to an FRQ can end up losing points just because they wrote the wrong term. So they really, really need to have driven home the importance of differentiating between demand and quantity demanded. The way that I like to do it is I like to draw it and actually show them exactly what we're looking at. So I'll draw two demand curves, one with demand on it and one with quantity demanded on it, and kind of discuss what the difference between the two concepts are. So the big things that you want to emphasize is that for demand, demand is a continuum. It is the entire curve. It shows all of the possible quantities demanded at all possible price points. So demand can never be a number because it's showing all of the possible points of intersection between price and quantity. So overall demand basically tells you how many people want a product, not how many people can actually get it, but how many people want it. I'll usually tell the kids, I am currently demanding a Tesla Model S. I really, really want one. So I'm part of the demand curve for that Tesla. I may not have one, and I may not be buying one, but I still demand one. It's something that I would like to have. So we need to stress to the kids that it's the entire continuum. Every single part of that curve is the demand curve, and it represents overall demand for your product at all possible price points, and demand cannot be a number. So once I've gotten across to the kids that demand isn't a number, but rather the entire continuum, we then switch over to trying to explain, okay, well, if that's not, if demand isn't the number of product people want, then what is it? And so in this case, we then switch to our conversation about quantity demanded. And so usually what I'll do is I'll draw that same demand curve over here, and instead of having all of the points on the demand schedule, I'll just pick one. So in this case, I chose the price point of 8, and then I'll ask them how many of a product will people be willing and able to purchase at a price point of 8. And in this case, the answer for this example is 120. And I usually circle that answer on the x-axis, and I'll point to it and say, this is quantity demanded. It's a fundamentally different thing than overall demand, because quantity demanded tells you the amount of a product people are willing and able to buy at a specific price point. And so while changes in price do not affect demand, they do affect quantity demanded. So this is the part where we really want to hammer home the concept that changes in price do not change demand. They only change the quantity demanded. Going back to our Tesla example from earlier, whatever example you choose to go with, although I am not currently purchasing a Tesla at the current price point, is there a price point at which I would step in and buy it? The answer is going to be yes. And so this is where the law of demand comes in. The law of demand tells us that the quantity demanded for a product will increase as price goes down and decrease as price goes up. But you need to hammer home these are not changes in overall demand, only in the quantity demanded at various price points. Those people who are willing to buy a product at a lower price, they were demanding that product the whole time. They just weren't willing to pay the current market price for it. And if the price ever falls, they are going to purchase that product, but they were demanding that product whether they're currently purchasing it or not. The second main point of confusion when looking at the demand curve has to do with tracking shifts in demand versus movements in demand. So the easy way for the kids to remember it is that if it's a change in quantity demanded only, then it's a movement, and if it's a change in overall demand, it's a shift. But I think that usually requires a little bit of additional explanation. So the top graph that I just added here shows a change in quantity demanded. In this particular case, the change in quantity demanded happened due to a change in price. So we went from a price point of 8, where we had a quantity demanded of 120, to a price point of 2, where we had a quantity demanded of 180. This did not change demand. So changes in price don't change demand. All it did was change the number of people, or the amount of a product that people were willing and able to purchase. So those people who were purchasing the product at price point 2 that weren't purchasing it at the price point of 8, they were still demanding this product the whole time. It just now got down to a price where they were able and willing to make that purchase. So if it's just a change in the quantity demanded without a change in the overall curve, this is what's known as a movement. And there are two things that can cause movements along the demand curve. The thing that we're looking at here is a change in price. So if a change in price happens and nothing else occurs, this will cause a movement in demand. This is true for supply as well. But also, once we get the supply curve on here, if the kids see a shift in the supply curve, then that will also result in a movement along the demand curve, which you can't actually see here, but when we put the two curves together on the same graph, you'll be able to see that. So they need to know that if we're going from one point on the demand curve to another point on the exact same demand curve, and all that's changing here is price and quantity, then what this is called a movement along the demand curve. And they draw it doing your point A and point B and drawing an arrow in the direction of the movement. If price went up, it's going to be a movement to the left, and if price went down, it's going to be a movement to the right, as is shown in this particular example. We then want to contrast this with a change in overall demand. Now, in this lesson, we're not going to cover what causes demand to change. That gets its own separate video. It's going to be on the determinants of demand. But you will want to graph it out for them just to show them what a change in demand looks like so that they can recognize how this is fundamentally different from a movement along the demand curve. So over here, I show that in this case, we have an increase in overall demand, which means that there is a higher quantity demanded at all possible price points. So in this case, I've chosen a price point of 4. On our original demand curve, we had a quantity demanded of 160. But now on our new demand curve, we have a quantity demanded of 200. It's the same price point, but overall quantity demanded has changed for every single possible price point. This is showing an overall increase in demand. So if the entire curve, the whole continuum, picks up and moves somewhere else, this is going to represent an overall change in demand. Whereas if only your point on the curve changes, that is going to be a movement along the demand curve. And you may want to point out to the kids, just so they're on the same page, that if demand is shifting to the right, that's an increase in demand. And if demand is shifting to the left, that's a decrease in demand. It is super important that we make the kids use the terms right and left to describe the changes in demand, because if you let them use up and down, when we get to supply, things are going to get really, really confusing. So there's only two directions things go in economics. They go to the right or they go to the left, not up and down, not in, out. Right and left are their only two options. So I think drawing these things next to each other makes the difference between movements and shifts a little bit more clear. They don't know what causes shifts in the demand curve yet. That's a lesson in and of itself, but at least they can see and they can tell the difference between the two just by looking at it.